Hello out there and welcome to this week's edition of GeoPortfolio. My name is Mikkel Rosenvold. I'm the head of geopolitics here at Stena Research. And this week I'm all by myself in the show, but not to worry, we have some juicy content nonetheless. I released an article this Tuesday called Plan Accordingly, Ukraine will lose within 12 months. That might be a bit of a baity headline, but nonetheless that is my current assessment. And I'll explain why in a minute. The US recently passed the new aid bill for Ukraine and Israel, which is going to be a huge boost for Ukraine. But I fear that the effect is going to be relatively short term. What are we seeing right now? Well, first and foremost, the Ukrainian forces are experiencing heavy ammunition shortages. That's one of the worst things to occur within battle. And it means that the Russians have had some successes when keeping up the pressure on certain sectors of the front line, especially near Avdiivka. The Russians are yet to make huge breakthroughs or great gains, but it's very clear that the Ukrainians are on the back foot and are lacking shells for their artillery in particular. US aid will alleviate this problem enormously. We expect a lot of US weapons caches in Europe to be opened and sent to Ukraine. Because the armed forces now have the funding to restock these caches afterwards. Nonetheless, what we're seeing is that Russia, along with its allies, are simply outproducing the West. The West has huge production potential, but we haven't mobilized it nearly to the same degree as Russia or China, or especially North Korea. To put it sharply, North Korea is almost outproducing Europe right now, which is quite embarrassing for Europe. The second sign I'm seeing at the moment that's really worrying me for Ukraine is the battle over the airs. Throughout the war, we've been puzzled by how the Russian Air Force have lacked the ability to establish and sustain air superiority over the battle space. The Ukrainians have been extremely talented at shooting down Russian planes and rejecting Russia the air superiority needed for larger offensive operations. On the other hand, as I've pointed out many times, air superiority is exactly what the Ukrainians needed for their past summer offensive to succeed. So now we're seeing increased Russian air attacks. We're seeing the Ukrainians, as a result of ammunition shortages, having problems shooting down enough Russian planes. This doesn't mean that Russia has air superiority and they're doing what they want in the airspace, but they're getting there slowly. Again, the US aid will alleviate this problem short term, but unless Ukraine is provided with a whole package of Air Force assets, I fear that Russia could establish localized air superiority over certain sectors of the front line, which will aid their offensive operations greatly. Especially, this could open up the opportunity for Russia to conduct more mobile offensive operations, which could leave Ukraine really, really vulnerable, as Ukraine doesn't have too much defense in depth established. This leads me to sort of the theoretical conclusion here that Russia is now maintaining the initiative. I've been developing this pendulum of initiative, which basically starts in February 22 of the invasion, where Russia obviously had the momentum, shifted throughout 2022 for the Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensives. Ukraine had the momentum. Russia regained the momentum for the Bakhmut offensive. Ukraine tried to regain the initiative for the summer offensive, and now Russia have gained it for their winter offensive over 23 to 24. Now, this should mean that Ukraine would regain the momentum. If you can see the arrow ends in the Russian half, it should rebound to Ukraine, but it doesn't. It seems that Russia is maintaining the initiative throughout the winter and will maintain it over the summer. The Ukrainian side are simply not conducting offensive operations at the moment, not at any larger scale anyway. This is a huge shift because so far the war has been characterized by this shifting initiative and momentum in battle. And the fact that Russia now single-handedly holds the initiative is a huge shift and gives the Russians a whole new plethora of options strategically. So what does this mean? Well, I expect Russia to push on the offensive, especially within the next few months until the US aid really kicks in. This will most likely mean an attack in the north of the current front line, up near Kharkiv, And while I don't expect Kharkiv to fall right now, we must look at whether the Russians will be able to encircle the city or, to some degree, surpass the city. If the Russians are able to do that, it leaves the entire left bank, as we call it, the east bank of the Dnieper River, vulnerable to attacks, and would set up the Russians for offensives in 6 to 12 months' time, to further offensives in 6 to 12 months' time. I don't see the Ukrainian lines breaking at the moment, but I do expect the Russians' offensives to be really, really strong. The Russians have had very, very great success at their so-called silent mobilization. We haven't seen these great mobilization pushes, but instead the Russians have silently mobilized and brought in more and more volunteers, mercenaries, foreign volunteers, etc., to field a really, really huge army. The Russian home front is relatively secure, and I think the Russians are really, really optimistic at the moment. So when I say that Ukraine will lose within 12 months, that might seem as a very pessimistic outlook. Well, here is a potential timeline for things. As mentioned, over the summer of 2024, I expect a major Russian offensive, mainly against Kharkiv. I don't necessarily expect Kharkiv to fall. That would be a worst-case scenario for Ukraine. If Ukraine manages to hold off the Russian offensive, that would open, in my opinion, a window for negotiations in the autumn of 2024. I hope and I think that many Western governments are right now preparing their own mindset for this. We've basically spent the past 2 years debating on how to let Ukraine into EU and NATO once they have defeated the Russians. But now I think both Ukraine and the West must prepare for a scenario where Russia isn't defeated, where it's more likely that Ukraine is defeated. If the Ukrainians can more or less hold off the Russians in the summer, there will be a window for negotiations in the autumn. The Russians may lose a lot of men and may see this as an opportunity to gain a favorable peace agreement. If not, that's actually a very bad scenario, in my opinion, if negotiations do not conclude in a peace deal within the autumn of 2024. Because this means that Russia will likely launch another winter offensive. They've used the past 2 winters for major offensives. Could mean the fall of Kharkiv. It's mainly been in the winter that Russia have taken these larger city gains and increased Russian bombardments towards Kiev and Odessa. If the Russians manage, and I know there are a lot of ifs here, but this is conjecture, so obviously there are going to be a lot of ifs. If that happens, it would, as mentioned before, open up for a broad Russian offensive towards Kiev or towards Odessa. And in that situation, we are looking at a potentially relatively quick Ukrainian capitulation, because Ukraine do not want their major cities overrun by the Russians, and at that point, we could be looking at something like the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan a couple of years ago, where once the enemy gets really moving along the front line, the internal decision-making of moving towards a capitulation or surrender can be really, really, really fast. 2 further points here. One, what will these negotiations or surrender look like? Well, we had a blueprint for a peace treaty back in March 2022 after about 1.5 months of fighting. Russia offered a peace deal. Ukraine were close to accepting it, but seemingly got the support they wanted from the West and kept on fighting. Now, many in the West will probably be hoping that we can return to this peace deal that would leave Ukraine more or less intact, that would allow Zelensky to remain in office, but perhaps give Russia some assurances that Ukraine will not join NATO as a whole. This is not realistic in any way. Russia will never accept these peace terms again. Russia will most likely demand, first and foremost, some sort of breakup of Ukraine, or if Ukraine is to stay intact, that Ukraine must stay within the Russian sphere of influence. This means that either we in the West have to accept a division of Ukraine of some sorts, where perhaps the western part can join EU and NATO, or an intact Ukraine that is in the Russian sphere of influence. Furthermore, it's very unlikely that Russia will accept Zelensky as head of state for Ukraine in the future. It's possible that Russia will accept some sort of middle ground solution for an interim government, but these are really, really tough pills to swallow for the West, and that's going to be a huge dilemma. Final point here. This potential timeline opens up some windows that are very, very important to your portfolio. I've written them about those windows more extensively in my post at Stena Research. You can go check them out. But basically, don't look too much at these dates. They're my guesses, but look at these windows. When Russia does this attack, what does this mean for your portfolio? You can check out my concrete recommendations at stenresearch.com. You can still sign up for 30% discount with the code GEO30. So go out there, check this out. And then we'll be back next week with Anne as part of the show again. Hopefully a bit more optimistic about things in the next edition of GeoPortfolio. My name is Mikkel Rosenvold, and this was this week's GeoPortfolio. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll see you either next week here or at stenresearch.com. Thanks a lot.